Hello? There we go. Thanks, Liam. So it's been about 10 years since I've actually stood up in front of people and done a sermon. And I was actually saying to Liam beforehand is I can stand in front of a board of directors and put together an investment option, but put me up here and I'm like a child with sweaty palms and very nervous because we're dealing with people's lives. So my background is very much, I've been in corporate for almost 25 years now, and my passions are actually things like exciting stuff like organizational effectiveness, but also leadership, and I'm very passionate about coaching. And in my career, I've had the privilege of actually sitting in and attending some of the world's best business schools. And there's one thing I've actually learned is, in terms of leadership, the best book you can read is the Word, is the Bible. It's actually all in there. And you can draw lines from everything they teach you in business school on leadership. You can actually draw lines into the Word. And I always say it's the ultimate foundation. And there's some biblical principles in the workplace. Now, obviously in the workplace, we have values. You have leadership values, company values, society values, and sustainability values. And I found that Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit, we all know it very well, is a very good introduction to those values. Have we got the slides? There we go. And these are founded on biblical principles. And if I break these down and we go into a bit more detail, what we actually see is that we've got love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. By the way, this is not the message I'm going to give you today. This comes for free. It just leads it into it because I'm going to be talking a lot about my experience in the corporate world. But if we talk about love, it's an unselfish concern and an affection for others. Joy is the exuberance about life and optimism. Peace is serenity and inner peace. Patience is not only waiting, it's how we act while we are waiting, and also a willingness to stick with things. Kindness is treating others with respect and a sense of compassion. Goodness is a desire to do good to others. Faithfulness is involved in loyal commitments and being trustworthy. Gentleness is not needing to force our way in life or into any situations. And then self-control, which is the ability to marshal and direct our energies wisely, or self-discipline. Now that actually sums it up. And if you look at many companies' values nowadays, you'll be able to draw them and you'll be able to reference them to one of these. So my challenge to the leaders, and especially the younger generation, if you want a good lesson in leadership, just try and live this. I promise you, if you live this, you're going to be the leader that God created you. But the message that I actually want to talk about today is a bit of a tough one. So unfortunately, it's not an easy message, and the message is about blame. Its impact it has on our organizations, the impact it has on our relationships, on society. Now, what is blame? So blame is when someone declares someone else is at fault and responsible for a bad situation or event. Someone declares that someone is at fault and responsible for a bad situation or event. It's not a positive word. When you blame somebody, or when blame is laid at somebody or pointed at somebody, it's usually not a good thing. It's usually quite negative. But the problem is, there are very few instances, if any, that it's actually helpful. But it is a problem in our society at the moment. I want to talk about this. I'm going to expand a little about it and tell you a few stories from my life. But first, I want you to think of a situation. And it could be at work, it could be in a relationship, it could be between parents and children, where something at work has gone wrong and your boss is actually just, where you've dropped the ball and he's giving it out or dishing out the blame. Or they are. In a relationship, you may feel blamed for a situation that was not your fault. At home with your parents, you might be blaming your parents for something that happened. Your kids might be blaming you. It doesn't make you feel any good. When you're in that situation and somebody blames you for something, even if you know it's your problem, or even if you know you are responsible, you don't really feel good about it, do you? Because, I'll get into the reasons for a moment, but the reason why we blame is we want to make somebody else responsible for our problems. If we blame somebody else, then they need to change, not us. We can sit back and wallow in our blamelessness. And it actually is something that is a problem because it doesn't actually fix the situation. So when blame occurs, it doesn't fix the situation. Now, from my personal life, there was a time in my career where I was really struggling. It was earlier on, I'd just been promoted to a place where I was actually leading a team, but unfortunately I was working for a manager who was extremely abrasive and very toxic, and would often shout, scream at you, and if they couldn't sort of get through to you on work issues, make it personal. And I was really struggling with this. It was a very difficult time. It was so difficult, in fact, that even my family was saying, wow, you're so angry. And I was very angry. And I'd sit with my pastor and I would say, why is this happening? This is not fair. Everybody can see what's going on in the organization. Everybody could see. Everybody was suffering under the same abrasiveness and toxicity. And I said to him, why is this happening? And his answer to me was, you're in the fire being refined, and God's not done with you yet. And it was only later on I learned a very valuable lesson, which I'll actually share with you in a moment. But I blamed the organization. And it didn't fix the situation. I mean, I was just continuously blaming, and people were getting tired of it. But I could also see the impact it had on the organization and what it was actually doing in the organization. And studies show that companies with a blame culture sometimes do get things done, but over the longer term, it doesn't actually work out. It actually starts negatively impacting the organization's performance. Now, we see it as I work in the mining industry, and it's not the safest place to work. We deal with heavy machinery, and we dig very big holes in the ground. Unfortunately, when things go wrong, it happens quickly, and people can get injured and sometimes get killed. So what do we normally do when there's an incident? Is we want to learn from our incidents to prevent them from happening again. So if something bad happens, in the past we'd say, who's to blame for this? We'd find the person to blame and we would discipline them, thinking that would solve the problem. And for a short period of time, it does actually impact, is you find the people who are at fault and you deal with them. You blame them for it. But then we actually started noticing on the industry, we started noticing that things weren't getting better after a while and started getting worse. And the reason for this is because we were creating a blame culture in our organizations. Now, what is a blame culture? Well, think about it. If you're going to constantly get blamed for something, are you going to talk about anything? No. We can't learn from our incidents when people weren't telling us things were going wrong. They were trying to hide it because there was only a negative consequence any time they actually spoke up. So we couldn't learn from it. And it was very important for us to actually create an environment where people could share, where we wouldn't blame them, but we would look at ways we can fix the situation and create what we call a psychological safe space for people to speak about what has happened, mistakes they made. Everybody makes mistakes. That's actually how we learn. Now, in a toxic culture, they don't accept your mistakes, so people never learn. They never grow. So an interesting study that was actually done by Duke University, and Harvard Business Review wrote an excellent article about it, and I'm actually quoting from them, is we're actually naturally wired to blame. It is actually a natural thing that we do. So when things go wrong, we have a built-in defense mechanism. Because if someone else is blamed for our problems, then they must change, not us. And there's a biological explanation for this. Now remember, I'm a geologist. I studied rocks. I'm going to start talking about the brain. So I am going to use quite a little bit of geological poetry in this discussion as well. But basically, to sum it up, and an excuse to everybody that I might be going wrong, is positive experiences are usually processed in our prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, which handles our higher cognitive functions, like reasoning, problem solving, and importantly, decision making. And naturally, due to a higher volume of information that we're getting in, it tends to be quite slow at it compared to the other parts of our brain, or a little bit slower. It's also interesting is that when good things happen, we tend to actually believe that it happens by luck. How lucky was I that this thing happened to me? Negative events, however, are processed in the amygdala, which is a very small part of our brain, which controls our fight or flight response. Now, you've heard of that before, fight or flight. And it's a very important part of your brain for survival. Because when something, or for instance, when you're in a situation, or a very dangerous situation where you're encountering something that can hurt you, for instance, you see a snake in front of you, or you're busy texting down the road, and all of a sudden you look up, you're in the middle of the road, and you look down, and there's a bus approaching you quickly. Your amygdala kicks in. And what it does is it reacts very quickly. It says you need to move quickly and get out of the situation. What it actually does is it even shuts down your cognitive functions as well, because it doesn't help reasoning in that situation. Oh, that's an interesting bus. I wonder how that got you. Maybe I should quickly finish writing this text before... No, you actually go into reaction mode. There's no time for reasoning. And what is interesting is that when we are in a situation where someone is under verbal attack or someone's blaming us, guess which part of the brain kicks in? It's our fight or flight response. Because we believe we have to defend ourselves. And blame actually triggers this. The amygdala takes over and reasoning goes out the window. Think of the last time you were in an argument. Think of the last time somebody blamed you for something. You weren't reasoning. Now, what's interesting is this part of the brain usually concludes that when bad things happen, they actually happen on purpose. So remember, good things happen by luck, and we have this belief, or this automatic belief, that bad things happen on purpose. So we automatically believe that the person close to the problem is actually doing it on purpose. And this is all happening so quickly that sometimes we're not even aware of that assumption. The other thing that the amygdala does is it also stores, it remembers. When you're in a bad situation, it remembers that. And it stores it in the back of your mind, and it creates a trigger. So that when it happens again, you'll react even faster the next time. And further to this study, they also found that when you have a bad situation or a bad event happens to you, you feel it far more intensely than a positive situation. They even managed to put a number to it. They said, if you have a bad experience, how much good experience does it take, or what magnitude of good experience does it take to actually cancel out the bad experience? And believe it or not, they said the answer's around about 5 times. So when we have an argument and someone says something that hurts us, and they say sorry, that's why we often don't feel so good. Or when something good happens afterwards, we want more, we need more to actually make ourselves feel much better. So it takes a lot more good to actually cancel out the bad. And this is important when we think about it. And it's good to know these things. Or at least I think so. Sometimes, however, we get into situations where there is no one to blame. Might be sickness in the family. Might be a drought. It might be in society, things going wrong in society, where different groups are blaming each other. Because remember, we have this inner desire to blame something or someone. Sometimes we create something to blame. Some of the conspiracy theories are actually coming out of this. Is we've got to blame someone. Someone's responsible. And if you can't blame somebody, it's invented. Sometimes we blame God. And unfortunately, that's no help. Blaming God does not change the situation. But so many people in the church have been hurt, and they need someone to blame. So they blame the church or they blame God. And it's sad. Because it doesn't matter if we blame an event, the effect is still the same. The situation doesn't improve. So we get back onto blame, the destroyer of hope. It can destroy relationships, it can destroy families, it can destroy companies, and it can destroy countries. We often see politicians blaming each other, pointing the fingers, but we're still stuck in the same situation we've been stuck in for such a long time. Bruce actually did a long series about a wall and the walls that we often face. And for me personally, what I was describing earlier on in the work example was a wall for me. I couldn't get through it. I was angry at God for the situation I was in. I was angry on the effect it was having on me and on my family. And I was angry that he wouldn't take me out of that situation, just leaving me there to refine. And it was extremely hard. And I remember one day after one of our altercations, the whole team was in the room, and me and this boss of mine were having a go at each other because I wasn't going to do the flight reaction. I would go in and fight. And we had an argument. And at the end of it, I just sat there, and one of my colleagues actually stayed behind. Sat there, and I used that as an opportunity to play the victim, obviously, and say how terrible this is, and why look at this, and we can't carry on like this, and looking for someone to agree with me, because I was laying the blame on the person. And she looked at me and she said, "Have you ever thought that you might be part of the problem?" I thought, "Whoa, hang on a minute, what's going on here?" And what she actually ended up describing me, she says, is what I was actually doing, and I'd get so worked up. And I'd think I'm speaking normally and being rational and calm, meanwhile I wasn't. And I had a very forceful body language as well. And she says, "Maybe you're the trigger." And all of a sudden I started changing the way I was thinking about the situation. So instead of blaming, I thought, okay, and I started looking at how I can change that particular situation. And guess what? I did. So instead of blaming, all I would actually do is I'd actually think is, how do I impact the situation? And how do I influence the team that I've just been put to manage? How do I make sure that doesn't actually creep into the team? Because I can see what the toxic effect that it actually has. So that is one of the stories that I managed to deal with. But it was actually, there's some interesting, if you get to the Word, if you go to the Bible and you start looking up and you start reading up about blame, things start getting very interesting. Now, there are many translations. Obviously, the first one we go to often is the NIV. I really enjoy the Amplified. And one of my favorites is the Message. And there are other translations. And this, going to different versions actually gives you a very interesting perspective and a little bit of depth. But I've actually discovered a really cool version recently, and it's the Gen Z Bible. And I'll be reading to you from it. So just those who might not know, we divide it into generations, and Gen Z are those of the age about 12 to 27. I'm considered Gen X. My parents were boomers, and my children are the Gen Zs, but some of you are what they call the millennials, who were born from 1981 to 1996. Now, it is very much a generalization, but what is quite interesting is each one of these generations have a specific language and the way they describe the world. So let's actually go, and I'm going to start say, well, where did this blaming all start? So we go to to Genesis 3, 1 to 13, and for those of you, you're welcome to follow in your version of it. But here it goes from the Gen Z Bible. Back when the world was still fresh, God decided to make a guy out of dust, breathed life into him, and boom, we got our first dude. Chilling in this lush spot called Eden. It was the original paradise, complete with mystery trees, one for life and one for knowing too much, the good and the evil. God was like, eat from any tree you want, but hey, the knowledge tree is off limits. Touch that and it's game over. But then God thought, man shouldn't solo this gig. So he crafted a woman from the man's rib, making the first ever dynamic duo. Enter the crafty snake, throwing shade on God's one rule, tempting the woman with fruit that was supposed to make them like top G. She was sold, took a bite, and even shared with her man. Suddenly they were like, whoa, we're naked, and fashioned some fig leaf fits. When God strolled in for an evening chat, our first couple went into stealth mode, hiding among the trees. God was like, where you at? And the man was like, hiding, because I'm naked and all that. God, knowing something was up, asked, you didn't eat from that tree, did you? The man passed the buck on the woman, who then blamed the snake. A classic blame game. And actually, Adam even blamed God. He's saying, this woman that you gave me made me do it. And that's actually where the blame game started. So if we really do want to blame anybody, I suppose we could always go back down there, but it's not going to help your situation, is it? One of my favorite verses in, parts of the Bible is John 9, and it's verse 1 to 7. And it's where Jesus heals the blind boy. And he spits in the mud, puts it on his eyes, and sends him to wash it off. And afterwards he sees. It's a well-known story. But also from the Gen Z Bible. And you'll see where I'm going with this a little bit later on. So, Jesus is cruising by and spots a dude who's been blind from the get-go. His squad's like, yo, Jesus, who messed up? This guy or his folks? Jesus is like, nah, it's not about who messed up. It's showtime for God's skills. We've got to hustle with the daylight we got. I'm the world's spotlight. Then he whips up some DIY mud with his spit, slaps it on the guy's eyes, and he's like, hit up the pool of Siloam and take a wash. Dude does it, and bam, sight restored. Neighbors and onlookers are all, isn't this the same guy who was always hitting us up for change? Some are convinced, others are, nah, it just looks like him. But the guy's insistent. For real, it's me. They're like, so how'd you score the vision upgrade? He's all, the Jesus dude worked some mud magic on my eyes, sent me to wash, and now I'm seeing 4K. And this is very interesting because so Jesus is cruising by, and the disciples are actually asking a very valid question. They're saying, here's a blind person who messed up. And it's a good question. They're actually saying, because at the time, they were thinking about the generational curses. But even if they could find that wasn't going to change it. And it was quite interesting because what Jesus actually said, no, it's not about who messed up. And if we go further and we go actually into the message, what the message says, and this was absolutely profound for me, is what Jesus' response was, you're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause and effect here. You're asking the wrong question. You're looking for someone to blame. There's no such cause and effect here. Now, he's not saying that generational curses don't exist. And I know that there are probably people here who have actually been freed from generational curses. But he said in this particular situation, it's not about that. This has had a massive impact on my life because it actually changes our perspective. It's not about the cause and the effect. And then after this, he says something even more profound. He says, look instead for what God can do. Look instead for what God can do. So rather ask what God can do about the situation than, hey, Lord, why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening? Where's this coming from? Look instead what God can do. And we can do that in the corporate world as well. So practically, when you're dealing with a situation where somebody messed up and it happens, don't look for someone to blame. Ask your team, what can we do about it? How do we fix this? How do we prevent it from happening again? That's not blame. Blame doesn't mean to say there's no justice. That actually happens. People have to take responsibility, but you don't have to blame someone for them to take it. So how do we get over this wall and beat blame? So I've shared a little bit about my life, but there's 4 things I'd like us to consider from the Word. So first one, number 1 is avoid the blame game. And Matthew 7, 1-5 from the Message says, don't pick on people, jump on their failures, criticize their faults, unless, of course, you want the same treatment. That critical spirit is a way of boomeranging. It's easy to see a smudge on your neighbor's face and be oblivious to the ugly sneer on your own. That was my situation. I was blaming somebody else, not looking inward to see if I was a part of the problem and potentially a cause to it. Nothing good comes from the blame game. And we do need to look inwards. And that was one of the biggest leadership lessons I ever had. And again, it doesn't mean to say there shouldn't be consequences or justice. A lot of the time, you don't have to blame someone. They usually know they're actually responsible. Number 2, asking the right questions. From the verses, you're asking the wrong question, you're looking for someone to blame. Instead of asking what and how, or rather ask what and how instead of asking who. Instead of asking who's to blame, what and how can God change our situation? What do I need to do? How can He change? How do we give Him that chance to actually impact our lives and work miracles? How do we prevent this from happening again? Those are the kind of questions we should be asking. Number 3, pray and ask what God can do about it. In John 9, Jesus said, ask instead what God can do. In Jeremiah 33, it says, call to me and I will answer you. And tell you, even show you great and mighty things. Matthew 7:7 is, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened. Something else that is implied in this word is not just once, continuously asking, seeking and knocking until you hear from God. And as with the healing of the blind man, he had to do something. So we must also be very attentive, and if God tells us to do something, we must be obedient. So he had to go to the pool of Siloam and wash the mud from his eyes. Fourthly, avoiding blame reveals the glory of God. Once again, from the awesome Gen Z version. If you're not vibing with fruit, you're out. Stick with me, and you'll be the fruit ninja. Try going solo, and you're basically kindling. Stick with me, ask what you want, and it's yours. Now, that's how we roll and show we're legit. He's like, just as Pops has got my back, I've got yours. Stay in my love loop. Here's the deal. Love each other hardcore. No love beats giving it all for your squad. You're not my minions. You're my peeps. Because I've shared the deets from Pops. You didn't DM me. That's a direct message, by the way. I slid into yours. You're chosen to go big, bear fruit, and whatever you ask Pops in my tag, you got it. Commandment, just love each other. No trolls allowed. And then just for those who need it, the next one is just from, I think it's from the NIV. The same verse, if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit. And that's how we glorify God. And avoiding blame actually reveals that glory. And blame shades it or hides it. So it's very important. And that's it. That's my message for today. Beating blame is avoid the blame game, ask the right questions, pray and ask what God can do about it, be obedient, and avoiding blame reveals the glory of God. So I'm just going to end off in prayer and just call up the worship team. So dear Lord, we just give you all the glory, and we desire to establish your kingdom here. We thank you for your wisdom you give us through your word. Wisdom for all aspects of our lives. Forgive us where we have blamed others. Give us wisdom in difficult situations and help us avoid the blame game. We look to you where we have a difficult situation. We ask your help and guidance, and we may even need a miracle, Father. Speak to us. Show us what you need to do, and we will be obedient. We long to see your glory revealed in our lives and the lives of others. Glory to you. Amen.